The opening remarks, after these opening remarks that is, contains a philosophical rant on my part, denouncing the state of modern Western philosophy. I would ask you to bear in mind the following 2 points. The rant is followed by a precise analysis of why I make the claims and accusations I do against most of the participants in modern philosophical, especially YouTube debates. And secondly, there are obviously a few exceptions from my more damning accusations. We had a moment, for example, Bernardo Kastrup is doing a much better job than most philosophers of mind are. However, even Kastrup is open to criticism on certain points. We'll go into those later. Furthermore, one might say that even though people like Bernardo Kastrup and Philip Goff embrace a consciousness endorsing, which is to say they take the idea that consciousness is fundamental as fundamental, although they take that point of view, the way in which they engage in modern philosophical debate actually undermines their own philosophical credibility in many ways. They become part of a kind of narcissistic circle of YouTube self-congratulation and self-involvement, which actually kind of just undermines the importance of the topic. And another aspect which is important is that neither Kastrup nor Goff actually say anything very new. A lot of it's been said previously in Western philosophy, so one wonders why it has to be said again as if it were new, although Kastrup doesn't say it's new, and Goff does also point out that these things have been said before. But somehow it's treated as if it's new, and they're treated as if there's sort of some new amazing development in modern philosophy. Well, there's not. They're just actually pointing out the idiocy of modern philosophy as it has developed, and their willing engagement with the idiots around them kind of undermines their own insights. Furthermore, the insights of people like Kastrup and Goff are, fairly insignificant compared to the major, precise analysis within Buddhist philosophy. Kastrup says nothing which isn't contained in Yogacara philosophy, and Yogacara and Chittamatra Buddhist philosophy has far more precision and depth than Kastrup, Goff, or any other consciousness-endorsing modern philosopher, modern Western philosopher, provides. Another point which should be pointed out is that very rarely do you have modern philosophers actually thinking it's worth using the kind of Buddhist techniques of direct investigation of the direct investigation of the nature of consciousness through the precise meditation techniques developed within Buddhist philosophy. One of the reasons why Buddhist philosophy just makes Western philosophy look infantile is that these people knew through direct experience the ultimate nature of consciousness. anybody who does the lower levels of jhana meditation, as I have done, knows far more about consciousness than people who have not bothered to do this. And I should point out that my meditation abilities are not particularly advanced. In fact, they go as far as just beneath first jhana, or maybe first jhana, but the state just beneath first jhana is called access consciousness. It's a state in which conceptual thought just disappears. It's still kind of threatening to come back into dim recesses of clear awareness. Once you tip over into first jhana, conceptual thought disappears completely into blissful state of non-dual consciousness. But I mean, this is kiddie stuff compared to, committed Buddhist meditators. The upper levels of the immaterial states of consciousness, the state of neither perception nor non-perception, the state of infinite space, or rather the absorption of infinite consciousness, neither perception nor non-perception. These are states far beyond access consciousness, and people regularly go into deep meditation states where they still, with full awareness, but it's non-conceptual awareness, reside for periods of time in these states. As I say, people who can attain these states know far more about consciousness than anyone pontificating on YouTube without even trying to do a bit of meditational insight.
Finished the degree when I started the degree. Why is consciousness so baffling?
Because it's everything we have, all we are. So when I need to talk about consciousness, like now, I always say, what is it first, so we understand what it is. And as I said, it is everything. I define it as...
In that short clip from the Closer to Truth channel, which is presented by Robert Lawrence Kuhn, he asks the neuroscientist and psychiatrist Giulio Tononi, why is consciousness so baffling? The description of this episode of Closer to Truth reads as follows. How does consciousness weave its magical web of inner awareness? Even when all mental functions may be explained, the great mystery, what it feels like inside, will likely remain. This is the hard problem of consciousness. What could even count as a theory of consciousness, even in principle? Okay, the idea of the hard problem of consciousness derives from David Chalmers. And the idea is that neuroscience will eventually somehow explain the functions of consciousness, i.e. they will eventually say, oh well, a photon hits here, it goes through here, and this neuron over here gets excited, and that produces a colour red, but if this neuron gets excited, you'll get green. And then when these neurons light up, the mind will suddenly think about having breakfast. All this nonsense. I mean, this is not to say that neuroscience hasn't made a lot of progress in showing neural correlates of consciousness. when various functions of consciousness are carried out or performed, various areas of the brain do light up. The question is, does this mean that consciousness kind of is produced at the same time by the brain lighting up, or does consciousness light the brain up and produce the function of the brain? In general, the idea is assumed dogmatically that the brain's doing its job, doesn't need consciousness, and just consciousness kind of, goes along for the ride, so to speak, but the brain could do it all on its own. Now, the reason I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek in my description of this is there's no evidence for the metaphysical assumption that the brain is doing it all on its own, matter's banging around inside the brain, and that nothing else is really doing anything, but consciousness is just kind of glowing away happily to itself, having no effect on the brain whatsoever. Which is pretty much the materialist view. And what happens is that when psychologists see the brain lighting up, they assume that the brain lights up first and consciousness, there's a flicker of consciousness lighting up or doing its bit in the background, but it's pretty much irrelevant to the functioning of the brain. And furthermore, it is the materialist position that consciousness is not anything beyond the brain doing its stuff, so to speak. States of consciousness are kind of illusory efflorescence from the brain, or even it is claimed by some that it is simply the brain doing its stuff. I mean, as we shall see, the statement is so absurd, so laughable, in that it's logically ridiculous, that I have difficulty actually uttering it, but some people do, and they sit in chairs called chairs of philosophy. Extraordinary. And this is what Kuhn is alluding to here. Although, to be fair, Kuhn has said in another interview that he keeps an open mind, but this is the kind of materialist perspective he's alluding to. His interviewee, Giulio Tononi, doesn't hold this view at all, and he says, to the question, why is consciousness so baffling, Tononi says, because it is everything we have or we are. But at least he is asserting that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and probably more fundamental than brain functioning, implying that somehow consciousness has got a hold of the brain rather than going along for the ride, so to speak, which is the position of the Russian physicist Michael Mensky, who I've mentioned in one of my other videos, which is available at the moment, and I shall mention again on many occasions, I'm sure. But Mensky quite clearly tells us that quantum physics clearly indicates that consciousness controls the brain, not the other way around. Stapp has a similar kind of view, although not as extreme. But Stapp also thinks that free will choice operates on conscious potentialities in the brain, producing changes in the brain to some degree. However, the point is that today the materialist account, which is, consciousness is kind of a weird efflorescent piece of nonsense which goes along for the ride whilst material bangs around in the brain are doing the real job, is pretty much the ascendant view. In my debunking Revelli videos, I have indicated that Revelli has put forward this kind of materialist view, although he tries to be clever, and he says it's not material bits and pieces banging around, it's their relationships. But consciousness still doesn't exist in its own right. It's just relationships between bits of matter producing the illusion of consciousness. Consciousness doesn't exist in its own right. And I've also mentioned another guy, Douglas Hofstadter, who tells us that millions of trillions of beer cans could produce consciousness if they were self-referring enough. This is what Hofstadter writes. I mean, you can't make this nonsense up, but these people manage to. It is a cosmic mystery how materialists come up with the utter infantile nonsense they come up with. But they do, and it can be entertaining. If rational people might get a bit upset, but I mean, if you just take it as a joke. When one seriously tries to think of how a beer can model of thinking or sensation might be implemented, the thinking and the feeling, no matter how superficial they might be, would not be localized phenomena associated with a single beer can. No, they would be vast processes involving millions, billions, or trillions of beer cans, and the state of experiencing thirst would reside in a very intricate pattern involving huge numbers of beer cans. I'm of the opinion that Hofstadter had consumed many beer cans before writing this drivel. And I will show you why Revelli's stuff and this kind of materialist nonsense is utter drivel. It can be shown to be drivel by logical analysis. The fact that philosophers today occupy chairs of philosophy in academic institutions spouting this infantile nonsense just shows you how corrupt modern philosophy, sociology, a lot of the departments are. People, totally incompetent, totally unable to string logical thoughts together, trot out materialist nonsense, and because it's the main paradigm, the narrative, it's cool, they're allowed to do so. I wrote this earlier to try and this stuff makes me angry. My philosophy of religion head of department, Pratima Bose, I've told this story before, but it's worth repeating, said to me I should go and get a lectureship in philosophy, and this is 40 years ago, but at that time I'd looked around what was going on in philosophy departments, the corruption, that people would adhere to all kinds of nonsense if it was the going paradigm, just to get lectureships, just to have jobs, get the cash in, feel they had a narcissistic thrill of having academic position, spouting nonsense. Anyway, in relation to the Hofstadter Bierkang, I've made this assertion about the absurdity of the materialist assertions such as Ravelli, such as Hofstadter, and many others. Dennett, for example. I made the assertion, which I will illustrate copiously in this and other talks, that modern Western philosophy, to a large degree, has become corrupt and degenerate. Many people who occupy positions of authority within philosophical academic institutions do not have the philosophical abilities which are necessary for their positions. And this situation has been produced, in essence, by the fact that philosophy has become, for many people and for many institutions, a matter of materialist dogma. Although, of course, there has to be dissident perspectives allowed in order to create the illusion of real philosophical inquiry. But the overwhelming mainstream perspective in modern science and philosophy is that of materialism. As a result of this, philosophers of remarkable incompetence end up occupying positions of academic philosophical authority just because they endorse the ludicrous materialist account of the generation of light from deep darkness. For, as the 6th century Buddhist philosopher Chandrakirti pointed out, such a claim would mean that deep darkness can arise from tongues of flame. This is precisely because the materialist position means that any entity could arise from its direct opposite in nature, and the universe would be a completely random place where anything could arise from anything without coherent connection between them. As we shall see on the issue of mind and matter, Buddhist philosophers throughout the ages, when examined with clarity and attention, show up the majority of modern Western philosophers for the incompetent frauds they so clearly are. And I'm going to look at the following clip from a YouTube channel called Mind Chat, in which a materialist philosopher explains her absurd, nonsensical, non-philosophical position and demonstrates that she's totally
including the endocrine system. Some people think that, but it's nothing over about the physical. So
right, thank you.
I'm going to defend.
That's really clear. So I suppose, because I think what's confusing is a lot of people think of materialism as just the view that the brain produces consciousness. But of course, Tim, our last guest, thinks the brain produces consciousness. He thinks that because he thinks the particles that make up the brain, as well as their physical properties that physicists study, they have these special non-physical capacities to produce non-physical consciousness. And normally those capacities are dormant. You know, that's why physicists don't notice them. But when particles come together in complex combinations, they kick in and the brain produces this extra non-physical level of reality. So so he thinks for that reason the brain produces consciousness. But okay, so I guess in a sense you might say the brain produces consciousness, but in a way it might be more accurate to say it's not that the brain states, physical states, produce feelings and experiences, but the physical states just are feelings and experiences, right? That they're one and the same thing. Yes, just like, so would it maybe be the same as water and H2O? So, it's not like the H2O in this glass produces water. The H2O just is water. That's what water is. So is that the same view, or at least the view you're
yes
actively defending? They're just the same thing.
In a word, yes. I mean, brain states can produce consciousness.
And here we have the deceptive and often used example of the supposed emergence of the properties of water from H2O, the molecular substrate of H2O, as being an analogy for the way consciousness is related to brain states, presumably the molecular makeup of the brain states. Not one of these philosophers seem to be aware that this analogy is completely fallacious. As the physicist Henry Stapp, who seems to be a far more competent philosopher than any of these three, points out in his discussion of the neurobiologist Roger Sperry's claims. Henry Stapp, who refers to the ideas of the neurobiologist and neuropsychologist Roger Sperry, who gave an emergentist account of the way consciousness emerged in some fashion, or was identical in some fashion to some other material base. In Sperry's case, he used the example of wheelness, basically asserting that consciousness was analogous to wheelness, so the material functioning of the wheels somehow produced this wheelness in the same way. But Sperry obviously wasn't good at his job. I think he poked around in people's brains, but when it comes to philosophy, God's sake. But anyway, we'll look at what Stapp says about this before looking at the water example. Well, Sperry got the Nobel Prize. He shared the Nobel Prize, in fact, for split brain experiments in monkeys and humans.
Produce consciousness. But
the first example, actually, that Roger Sperry gives, the neurobiologist, he says that consciousness is like wheelness. You can't make this nonsense up, but that they do. The reason that consciousness is not analogous to wheelness is that the properties that characterize wheelness are entailed by the properties specified in classical physics, whereas the properties that characterize consciousness are not entailed by the properties specified by classical physics. To make this plain, the qualities of consciousness are awareness, knowingness, an inner light on, if you like, is what awareness is. I know that I know. Meditation is useful because when you clear away conceptual thought, most philosophers of mind just sort of think about conceptual thought, they never think about the background, which is pure awareness. Clear away conceptual thought, there is still luminous, cognizant, clear awareness. Luminosity being the inner cognizant quality which remains even when you're not actually cognizing any particular object. If you don't meditate, if you've not experienced this, you do not know this. So you don't know about consciousness, like these people. So, matter is defined in the Cartesian worldview, which is the worldview these people actually live in. Matter does not have properties of awareness or knowingness or having an inner light on. If you look at the definition of matter, it is antithetical to such properties. So, wheelness, the ability of wheels to do their job, wheeling their way across concrete, this functionality of wheels is entirely explainable and entailed by the properties of the wood, if we're talking about cartwheels for instance, and concrete, and the shape of the wheel, i.e. there is a logical chain of explanation, chain meaning there are links of explanation from one logical step to the other. In a way that once you define matter as being antithetical, being non-conscious and with no capacity for consciousness, which is the Cartesian definition of matter, which is what these people use, unless they decide to become fraudulent and deceptive, which they often do. With these definitions, consciousness is nothing like wheelness. As Stapp says, there is a huge difference in principle that distinguishes consciousness from things that, according to the precepts of classical physics, are constructed or constructible out of the particles that are postulated to exist by classical physics. When we know the nature of particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, the forces within atomic structure, molecular forces, and the way that molecules make up wood, and then the actual solidity of wood, which is made up by these particles. Once you know the nature of concrete, once you know all this stuff, there's nothing surprising about wheels trundling across concrete. When matter is non-conscious and does not have the capacity of consciousness, which is a definition, there's something very surprising about light suddenly going on when matter's banging around in the brain. This is logic. You cannot produce light out of deep darkness, as Chandrakirti said. The same applies to the water example, i.e. that when you know the molecular makeup of water, the liquid properties of water, or even the ice properties of water, are entirely explainable from molecular structure. So if we consult an online chemistry exposition, we find water has long been known to exhibit many physical properties that distinguish it from other small molecules of comparable mass. Chemists refer to these as anomalous properties of water, but they are by no means mysterious. All are entirely predictable consequences of the way the size and the nuclear charge of the oxygen atom conspire to distort the electronic charge clouds of the atoms of other elements when these are chemically bonded to the oxygen. In other words, there's an entirely understandable explanation at the molecular level of all the functioning in all its states of water. It is not mysterious. It is explainable in a way that nobody can explain how non-conscious bits of matter, which is what materialists think the world is ultimately constructive of, even though matter itself is actually comes from the immaterial quantum field. We'll go into that at a later point. Now, Professor Janet Levin will say, well, she doesn't need a mechanism because she actually says that her consciousness is identical to physical processes. She's a materialist. But then one wonders what her definition of matter is, because if you're saying that consciousness is identical to the physical nature of matter, which is basically saying it is matter, then you must have a definition of matter which includes the possibility of matter giving rise to consciousness, which means you have to say, well, matter is stuff which has the potentiality to be solid stuff and also the potentiality to be consciousness, which means that matter must have an internal nature in some sense of consciousness. But this is not what materialists will say. If you ask them what matter is, if you say, well, of course, material's got an inner nature of consciousness, they'll say, no, it hasn't. Matter's matter. Matter is just physical. This is what I mean when I talk about these people being fraudulent. They'll define matter to exclude the possibility of consciousness in the definition, then claim that consciousness is nothing but matter doing stuff of a particular kind, or organizing itself in a particular way, or whatever. Doesn't stack up. But the discussion of, Roger Sperry's wheelness and H2O and water is relevant here, because these are often examples, as Philip Goff did offer as an example, which are proffered at the same time as this fraudulent identity theory of consciousness and non-conscious matter is asserted. My God! How do these people get in the positions they are in with this utter nonsense? Why does Philip Goff, who is at least proposes consciousness is the ultimate nature of reality, give the time of day to somebody who cannot even reason on a basic logical level? Incredible. I mean, on occasion one will find a philosopher of consciousness or consciousness studies or consciousness research just making up a word, expecting their readers, and readers generally do fall for this nonsense, will read the word and think, oh my God, with a word like that, this person must know what they're talking about. So, I see. Consciousness supervenes upon the organization of matter in the same way that the appearance of water supervenes upon the molecular structure of water. Extraordinary. Must be correct with a word like supervenience. Imagine I go for an interview at, I don't know, some Institute for Consciousness Studies, and I'm applying for the post of, I don't know, Professor of Consciousness Studies, and I go in, and they say, well, Dr. Smetham, I'm not a doctor, by the way, but just for the sake of the discussion, just for the sake of the story, well, Dr. Smetham, what are your credentials for the position of Professor of Consciousness Studies? I've made up a new word. Oh, you made up a new word? Yes. It will fool people into thinking that matter can become conscious. Oh, sounds promising. What's your new word? Genoconci-ratinus. Genoconci-ratinus. Sounds very technical. Yes, yes or no? Do you have a mechanism underlying the word? No. With a word like that, though, you may not need a mechanism. Everybody will be fooled. That's how it works. I have here an article published in 1993 by Oxford University Press. From supervenience to super-dupervenience, meeting the demands of a material world. Terence Hologram tells us that the etymology of the word supervenience appears to be spatially quasi-metaphorical, the idea being that something supervenient comes above, is grounded by that upon which it supervenes. Now really this entire article basically tells us that the history of the word supervenient is the history of an intellectual fraud. Concocting a word to give the appearance of something that cannot happen logically or physically or naturally in the world does happen by philosophical sleight of mind. And it more or less tells you this is what the entire oh dear, the entire scam is all about. Which is why I use such a crazy word, such a ridiculous word as super-dupervenience. Super-dupervenience would render higher order properties metaphysically respectable. I.e. he's saying, well, supervenience hasn't done the job really, because it hasn't done a good enough job of, sort of fraudulently convincing people that non-conscious, completely mindless, completely blank matter with no possible glimmer of consciousness inside it, when concocted together in various ridiculous ways, whatever they may be, in the brains or computers or whatever, can magically become consciousness. Supervenience has not done this magical task of convincing rational people. So we need super-dupervenience. Maybe super-dupervenience would do the job of convincing people that higher order properties are metaphysically respectable. But it is not a relation that comes cheap. Explaining ontological supervenience relations in a materialistically acceptable way looks like a very daunting task. Of course it is. It's impossible because it's logically impossible. I mean, whose difficulties suggest the need for materialists to consider seriously the prospects for preservative realism about it's basically making up words in order to perpetrate an intellectual fraud. Scams like this were being perpetrated in philosophy departments 50 years ago when I was doing my maths degree at Essex University around 1970. It was when I was there. In my first year, I read a book by the supposed philosopher A.J. Ayer, Language, Truth and Logic. Logical positivism was where it was at. More was going to be revealed about the world. And I read in this book that the meaning of the sentence Caesar crossed the Rubicon was, and the claim being made was precisely this: the meaning of the sentence Caesar crossed the Rubicon was, if someone were to go to the shores of the Rubicon and then started doing archaeological digging at the correct place on the shores of the Rubicon, then if they were in the right place, they would actually dig up the bones of Caesar. That was the meaning. Words did not have kind of meanings of their own. They only had meaning if there were kind of instrumental things that humans could do, like digging up bones on the shores of the Rubicon, and that was the meaning. I read this and thought it was utter drivel and nonsense. But it was the accepted paradigm for many philosophy departments. Later on, A.J. Ayer was interviewed by Brian McGee in a television series.
But now, it must have had actually some real defects. What do you now, in retrospect, think that the main shortcomings of the movement were?
Well, I suppose most of the defects is that nearly all of it was false.
So, we see that A.J. Ayer took 17 years. The McGee interview was around 1987. 17 years to realise something that I was fully aware of when I read his book in 1970. He was spouting utter nonsense, as he admits. It was false. So why was he doing this? A whole vast industry of nonsense, just as there's a whole vast industry of Wittgensteinian nonsense, generated from academic fraud, generated basically by the pursuit of academic careers. I mean, that's what I saw when I was at university. Not in maths departments or physics departments, you can't. In physics, you have to do experiments, and at least your interpretations have to have some degree of coherence with experimental results. And mathematics, you can't really make up utter nonsense, get away with it. Philosophy is not the same. Sociology is definitely. You can make up utter imbecilic nonsense. later on, when I was teaching maths and physics at a local college, I ran into somebody who was doing it's either a PhD or an MA in the cognitive science or computational science department under Maggie Bowden at Sussex University, and he was writing the first paragraphs of his thesis, and he was writing, it may be the case that consciousness seems to have its own modes of ontological validity, and that it is an aspect of the universe in its own right. We must resist the temptation to take this proposition seriously. Well, I said to him, well, on what basis do you make these assertions? And he said to me, well, I don't really believe it. I think it's not credible. But if I don't write the department line, I won't get my PhD or my MA. That's how it works. Let us look at another little clip from the Janet Levin discussion with Philip Goff and Keith Frankish. Take a listen.
One reason also for preferring practical reason for preferring a physicalist approach is that we know how to study the sort of the structure of the world, the dynamics of the world, the sort of things that are presented to us under the guise of physics. Now, if maybe behind all that, if Philip's right, there's a sort of world of pure consciousness that is kind of the ultimate basis of all of that. But we've no access to that. We don't know what it's like to be an electron or whatever, but we know what electrons do.
Again, this assertion by Keith Frankish is false, completely unphilosophical. And I've looked at some of the talks and interviews with Keith Frankish, and I'm sorry, to call him a philosopher is absurd. Quite a while ago, I was a computer programmer for quite a bit of my life. I was wandering my way to work, and I saw a van go past, and it had on the side, these people were called Bodgett and Leggett, and I thought, yes, that was very odd. Obviously, they were hoping that people would realise that their choice of name for the removal service, or their whatever it was, cleaning service, I think it was, or I don't know, repair service. But they obviously hoped that people would realise it's a joke. But I mean, people like Frankish are the Bodgett and Leggetts of the philosophy world. I mean, what is he saying here? Well, basically, we could just bodge it with, there may be consciousness knocking around in the background like Philip claims, but who gives a damn anyway, Yeah, we can get on with our life just by bodging around in the material world, so let's call it material anyway. This is basically what he's saying. This is not philosophy. It's nonsense. How do these people get into the positions they're in? And it's clearly nonsense because in terms of physics, physics has basically discovered the fact that at the foundational base of the so-called material world or physical world, and perhaps we should mention at this point that of course the modern materialist view of reality is not only confined to ideas of little billiard balls banging around. There's also the forces acting upon the supposedly little billiard balls or atoms or atomic particles, whatever modern materialists might think are the ultimate constituents. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to really understand what they do think the ultimate nature of the supposedly material world is. But the materialist view obviously involves not only atomic constituents but also forces between atomic constituents and forces between material entities, such as gravity, for instance. Also you have massless particles such as photons and so forth. But in general, the materialist view is bound up with the idea of solidity and matter and mass and real stuff, the stuff you can get your hands on, is really what seems to be at the back of the materialist mind, if they do have minds, in fact, by their own definitions, of course. However, it's interesting to look at what is really going on in modern physics in this context. I mean, here we have a book called The Theory of Almost Everything. Great book. And we read here, in 19th century physics, the universe contained two things, particles and fields. Particles were tiny and hard, like small billiard balls. Fields were elastic and spread throughout space. Particles produced fields according to their electric charge and their motion, and particles responded to the fields of the particles around them. Relativistic quantum field theory completely eliminates the distinction between particles and fields. Matter, the electrons and positrons, and forces, the photons, are both described in the same way by quantum fields. Quantum fields combine particle nature and field nature in a single entity. The quantum field spreads out through space, just like a classical field, but it is quantized. When you try to measure the fields, you always find a whole particle. So basically the particles aren't there, we've only got an immaterial field or an insubstantial field, and then when you try and measure, and what is measurement, we must ask in this context, when you try and measure, a particle appears. Now this man, is he a new age quantum mystic, sort of strung out on too much lysergic acid? He teaches physics at George Mason University. He's got a PhD from the University of Maryland. He has done research in areas of supergravity, especially as applied to superstring theories and in the quantum mechanics of chaotic systems. Don't think he's a drug fiend. And just to confirm the idea that quantum fields are actually insubstantial in their essential nature, Here's another very good book, excellent book. Quantum Reality. Theory and Philosophy. So Jonathan Allday tells us that in describing the nature of quantum fields, now, from a philosophical point of view, this is rather big stuff. A whole manner of speech rather naturally makes us think that there is some stuff or substance on which the properties can, in a sense, be glued. It encourages us to imagine taking a particle and removing its properties one by one until we're left with a featureless thing devoid of properties, made from the essential material that had the properties in the first place. Philosophers, have been debating the correctness of such arguments for a long time. Now, experimental science has come along and shown that, at least at the quantum level, the objects that we study have no substance to them independent of their properties. And if they don't have substance at the quantum level, they don't have real substance at any level, because everything is essentially made up of quantum stuff. However, the material world is quantum stuff acted upon by consciousness. Wait for the second part of this video series in which I shall prove that. But materialists and physicalists really are basically alluding to the fact that anything within the material realm, or the forces which act within the material realm, are to be taken seriously, but consciousness is not. This is basically the materialist position. And as Wojciech and Leggett philosopher Frankis has just said, this is just a Wojciech position to take because we've got no access to consciousness. But what he's saying basically is that the great Buddhist meditators who've explored the inner reaches of consciousness, people who experience jhanas to the level of realms of infinite consciousness, realms neither perception nor non-perception, are delusional. Well, I can tell you they're not. I've not been to the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. I've been to the realm just underneath or in the first jhana. The qualities and experiences of consciousness are quite clear, and they are self-revealing at that point. We'll look at some of the descriptions of consciousness within Buddhist philosophy in a moment, and in much greater detail in my next video on this subject. But another aspect, why Wojciech and Leggett Frankish is incorrect is because we don't need to claim that consciousness is not in the background. We don't need to claim that consciousness is irrelevant or consciousness is identical to materiality, or what it is he thinks. It's not very clear, because in other of his talks he kind of implies that consciousness is nothing beyond materiality, whereas here he seems to give a nod towards his mate Philip. Let's look at some of the stuff. What have some recent physicists got to say on this subject? This is Wojciech H. Zurek talking about the nature of quantum entities. Quantum states, by their very nature, share an epistemological and ontological role. They are simultaneously a description of the state and the dream stuff is made of. The dream stuff is made of. One might say they are epiontic. These two aspects may seem contradictory, but at least in the quantum setting, there is a union of these two functions. In other words, being and knowing interpenetrate at the quantum level, according to Wojciech Zurek, a very important quantum physicist. Here are a couple of clips of Zurek discussing his work.
So, the reason we need to understand quantum theory before we understand reality is that quantum theory is the only theory which is encompassing everything. It has no limits that we know of at least. So, quantum theory was discovered by looking at things which are very small. Electrons, atoms, photons. But as time progressed, we started testing it in systems which are bigger and bigger. And in some sense, the tests were done in the hope that it will break down. And it will break down in a way which will affirm our classical prejudices.
Our normal understanding of the macroscopic world.
And quantum theory is weird.
Tell me what that
is. It is weird because this means that if this glass can be here and it can be there,
yes,
it can be also in here and there at the same time. We don't see things which are here and there. We see things which are real, which are localized. Beyond that, because it says that using means that we use for perception, that is indirect measurements via photons and environments, we are restricted. We are forced to see things which end up having multiple copies, and these are the things which can survive for a long time. It has to be consistent.
Now, Zurek is not a quantum mystic by any means whatsoever. In fact, far from it. He's trying to be as precise as possible and produce an account of the way in which the classical world in somehow comes to be experienced on the basis of what he calls the weirdness of the quantum world, in which objects can be here or there at the same time. And Zurek is a decoherence theorist, and he's basically implying that a lot of the way in which quantum weirdness is tamed, so to speak, is a matter of an interaction between the way the classical world already is interacting with quantum weirdness at a deep level, ironing out the most weird aspects of quantum reality, leaving us with what he calls a menu of possibilities. However, if you've been paying attention, he does use the word perception, and at some point the many realities involved in the information exchanges going on within quantum information exchange end up being basically selected out through perception. Here is a paper quite an important paper by Zurek, Decoherence and a Transition from Quantum to Classical Revisited. The natural sciences were built on the tacit assumption information about the universe can be acquired without changing its state. The ideal of hard science was to be objective and provide a description of reality. Information was regarded as unphysical, ethereal, a mere record of the tangible material universe. an inconsequential reflection existing beyond and essentially decoupled from the domain governed by the laws of physics. This view is no longer tenable. Quantum theory has put an end to this Laplacian dream about the mechanical universe. Put an end to the Laplacian dream about the mechanical universe. Observers of quantum phenomena can no longer just be passive spectators. Quantum laws make it impossible to gain information without changing the state of the... The dividing line between what is and what is known to be has been blurred forever. And I chose Zurek here because he's not a raving consciousness creates everything, Deepak Chopra rules kind of physicist whatsoever. He's not a raving quantum mystic. Far from it. He tries to avoid, as far as possible, overblown assertions about consciousness creating reality. And in fact, he says that the role of consciousness is inescapable at the quantum level, but at the classical level it seems to be washed out. However, when you actually look at the details of what he says, the role of consciousness is still there, operating at the quantum level. So it's not washed out completely. The washing out, as it were, is just an appearance. But you have to analyze this stuff very carefully to see what is being said and what the philosophical implications are. That the schoolboy and schoolgirl approach of Keith Frankish and Janet Levin is just not appropriate. But if we look at some other quantum physicists, their views are a little more extreme from the point of view of a materialist perspective. Because if you analyse what's going on at the quantum level, consciousness clearly is involved. What we'll see, in fact, is that the process of reality is one of quantum potentiality triggered into manifestation by a primordial conscious energy. We'll go into that a bit later. Henry Stapp talked in the following terms. And Henry Stapp was someone who discussed this issue with Werner Heisenberg. He worked with John Wheeler. John Wheeler, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. The rebonding between mind and matter, achieved by physicists during the first half of the 20th century, must be seen as a momentous development, a lifting of the veil. Ignoring this huge and enormously pertinent development in basic science and proclaiming the validity of materialism on the basis of an inapplicable, in this context, 19th century science is an irrational act. Another quote from Henry Stapp. Philosophers of mind appear to have arrived today at less than satisfactory solutions to the mind-brain free will problems. And the difficulties seem, at least prima facie, very closely connected with their acceptance of a known to be false understanding of the nature of the physical world and of the causal role of our conscious thoughts within it. Max Planck, who was the inadvertent instigator of quantum theory, at the beginning of his career, he actually believed that the external, apparently material world was made of solid stuff. He didn't actually believe that atoms existed. He thought that they were mathematical fictions. And then at the end of his career, he stated, all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. I'll read from my book here, Quantum Buddhism. More recently, in an article in New Scientist, 23rd of June 2007, Michael Brooks, commenting on a quantum entanglement experiments carried out by teams led by Markus Aspelmeyer of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and Anton Zeilinger of the University of Vienna, tells us that the conclusion reached by the physicist involved is that we now have to face the possibility that there is nothing inherently real about the properties of an object that we measure. In other words, measuring those properties is what brings them into existence. The headline for the article states, to track down a theory of everything, we might have to accept that the universe only exists when we're looking at it. No, I don't believe that. I think it's a mistake. I think it's new scientists just making up headlines to catch people's attention. The idea that human beings go around collapsing wave functions with their intentional rays of consciousness, I've shown in my work to be false. It's primordial consciousness acting through sentient beings. It's a different issue. We'll go into that in the next video. But one can find several very significant quantum physicists. Another one is Michael Mensky, for example. Stapp's right to actually promote a materialist worldview in this, at the same time as saying you're following physics, as Wojciech and Leggett man seems to assert, is completely irrational. It's completely fraudulent. I mean, if you look at the evidence is consciousness is involved in some form. This is not to say there aren't some new age merchants who are completely overhyping the situation, but one needs to look at the evidence with some integrity and not adhere to a materialist paradigm merely because it's academically and career-wise advantageous, for whatever reason. No idea what. Why would you pretend to be a philosopher and not even bother to examine the evidence, but actually produce completely illogical viewpoints contrary to the evidence? Returning for a moment to the observation I made about Max Planck, the inadvertent instigator of the quantum revolution. This is a book by Jim Al-Khalili, Quantum Guide for the Perplexed. And Jim Al-Khalili writes about Planck, just to show that I'm not lying about this stuff. Page 36. Planck was conservative in his views and, in the early part of his career, did not even believe in the existence of atoms, as advocated by contemporaries of his such as Ludwig Boltzmann. Planck felt that it would soon be proved that matter was continuous, in the sense that it was not ultimately composed of building blocks, of fundamental building blocks, but could be infinitely divided up and still retain its essence. So, I mean, this indicates that Planck actually thought that, the material world out there was just internally completely continuous. There's no internal structure. And I find this remarkable when you compare this to some Buddhist philosophers such as Vasubandhu. And I will put up a quote in another video maybe, who says, well, there must be internal structure, otherwise you could not account for things like, the wearing away of rock under the influence of water. If things were internally completely continuous, then there's no weak point for which water could rub away. So the way that the actual external world functions require you to believe in some kind of internal structure rather than continuous substance. And this was an observation made by early Buddhist philosophers, but there were people who became quantum physicists, very famous quantum physicists, who believed that the world was internally solid. The true materialists, these people were, the early quantum physicists, well, Planck anyway. But at the end of his life, having looked at the experiments, done a lot of mathematics and research into quantum functioning, what does Planck what does Planck conclude? And this conclusion he promulgated in The Observer, an interview with The Observer, January 25th, 1931. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. I repeat, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. That's an extraordinary development from believing that the world is just continuous matter with no internal structure. And then 50 years later, believing that consciousness is the ultimate nature of reality. And he was not the only one. Came to conclusions similar to that amongst the early quantum physicists. Heisenberg was much more circumspect. But even Heisenberg, here is a quote from Heisenberg, which is a collection, Ken Wilber organised a collection of various quotes from quantum physicists. This is from Heisenberg. The quantum theory gives an account of the mechanical processes in the interior of the atom. It also incorporates Newtonian mechanics. And then he goes on to say that the Newtonian mechanical aspect is a limiting case in which we're able to objectify the events completely and can neglect the interaction between the object under investigation and the observer himself. So even Heisenberg gave intimations that he believed at a certain level, observer and observed interpenetrated. And certainly these physicists did not think that the quantum world involved ball bearings, but much, much smaller. Little ball bearing electrons moving around a little bit bigger ball bearing protons and neutrons, although very, very tiny ball bearings. But this is the kind of, I'm obviously being, what can we say, sarcastic, because this is the kind of picture one gets listening to the Wojciech and Leggett Brigade. The Wojciech and Leggett philosophical brigade of, let's look at something that Bohr said. So here's a quote from Niels Bohr, who, together with Heisenberg, put together the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, or Copenhagen Interpretation. Now, the quantum postulate implies that any observation of atomic phenomena will involve an interaction with the agency of observation not to be neglected. Accordingly, an independent reality in the ordinary physical sense can neither be ascribed to the phenomena nor the agencies of observation. Now, Bohr was famously, ambiguous and cryptic in his proclamation. So it is possible to interpret the agencies of observation as being human beings, but other people think, oh no, he just meant experimental apparatus. But as John Bell, another very famous physicist who's responsible for one of the most important mathematical puzzles within quantum theory, Bell's Inequalities, John Bell pointed out that if you analyse the actual quantum formalism, the final place where the buck stops, as Penrose puts it, is with consciousness. John Bell didn't believe it, but what he was saying was if you took the formalism as put forward at that time, then consciousness was involved. Robert Oppenheimer, another famous early quantum physicist, one of the major physicists responsible for the development of the atomic bomb, discoveries in atomic physics are not in the nature of things wholly unfamiliar, wholly unheard of or new. In Buddhist and Hindu thought, such ideas have a more considerable and central place. So, he saw connections between the interpenetration of observer and observed as being having a resonance from Hindu and Buddhist thought. So the first views of the quantum situation were definitely suffused with the idea that in some sense can we put it, an indeterminate realm of potentiality interacting with, in some way, with consciousness through the observational process, producing an experienced world of apparent materiality. The following clip is from a guy called Tom Campbell, who's a former NASA physicist, but whose investigations into the nature of quantum reality led him to become a researcher and writer and a promoter of a quantum mystical view of the nature of reality. But here he's talking about the way that the original Copenhagen view was undermined by people who are upset at the demise of a material world.
Now, the brief overview of that is that quantum mechanics started back in the early 1920s, okay, and the guys there, you know, Bohr, Heisenberg, Wigner, well, Einstein was involved with them. He wasn't primary in that, but so on. That group of people, Schrodinger, those guys came up with, in a big conference in Copenhagen, kind of a statement of the results of their experience. This was like the founding of quantum mechanics. So this is what started quantum mechanics. And after that, this explanation of here's what happened is really what the Copenhagen meeting was all about, presenting results. And here's what it means. Here's what it says. And that then was called the Copenhagen Interpretation. The word interpretation actually got added later when people wanted to find something that was more materialist based. They didn't like the weirdness of quantum mechanics. They wanted something that wasn't that weird. So it turned into interpretation, because certainly there is some other understanding of this that's more materialism based, has more material causality involved in it, and we just don't know it yet. So it was the Copenhagen Interpretation. That Copenhagen Interpretation has been kind of left behind, and it now the explanation of that double slit has to do with entanglement, that the slits are entangled with the particle, and the whole experiment is all entangled with each other. And this is why, this is how the information gets captured. It gets captured in this entangled thing. And so they've changed it in order to make it more amenable to materialism, basically. Their ideas have changed. But nobody's actually done the experiments to see if that's true. So I looked and looked and looked, and I had some physicists who, working physicists in academia, who had access to more than I had to search. They have.
If you check back with what Wojciech Zurek said in the first little clip by him, you see that what Tom Campbell says here is reiterated by Zurek. He says that physicists were hoping to reinstate the classical worldview after the Copenhagen view had been established. By the Copenhagen interpretation was not a materialist one. It had basically, on the one side, there were immaterial states of quantum potentiality, which became embodied, so to speak, within the mathematical formalism of the wave function. And then you have the intervention of measurement, which, according to people like Eugene Wigner and Stapp, in the early days, of course, Stapp wasn't around, so even Heisenberg was talking about the intervention, the interpenetration of observer and observed at deep level. So, and Bohr was mystically talking about, there is no quantum world, and that before the measurement occurs. So the Copenhagen view was certainly one which was, completely non-materialist. Even now, you must understand that what these materialists think is a material world, it's not. Even if we take on board, just for the sake of argument for the moment, if you were to say there's some material stuff out there, it is more than 99.9999999 empty space. There's nothing out there, really. There's a thin veil of flashes of apparent materiality. This is why all this nonsense about materialism is just nonsense. And the apparent solidity of the external material world really derives from the intermolecular forces rather than any real solidity. It's atomic forces holding molecules together. So, when I touch something which I cannot put my hand through, it's due to the atomic forces within whatever I'm touching and the apparent material of my hand. But in fact, the apparent material world is more like a hologram with atomic forces stopping various holograms walking through each other, is one way of looking at it, crudely put. The term materialism only makes sense, really in the days when Planck's view of either Planck's view of a continuous material world, or if there really were solid little billiard balls of atomic bits and pieces. The way the world is now, the idea of it being material, a material world in the sense of Cartesian matter, is just utter nonsense. Anyway, where was I going? Yes. Nevertheless, quantum physicists were so shocked they wanted to get back a classical world, a material world. So, if you look at what John Bell said, John Bell was a very, very important physicist at the time, and he was horrified, and we'll look at what he had to say on the issue. This is from our most recent book about David Bohm, who we'll come to in a moment, Tibetan Book of the Undivided Universe. And I'll be going into this in the second part, the second video in this discussion, this talk, what is consciousness. So John Bell, I'd say he's a very important quantum physicist. He came up with some very important ideas. And it was through one of the mathematical inequalities he developed that the non-local nature of quantum reality was established through what's called the Bell's inequalities. So he was a central figure in early quantum physics, and he says one wants to be able to take a realistic view of the world. But listen to what he's saying. He's not saying, I know through experiment the world is realistic. He's looking at what the Copenhagen view of the world is, and he doesn't like it because there's no matter there. So he says one wants to take a realistic view of the world, to talk about the world as if it is really there. And you've got to understand what is going on here. The Copenhagen view, revealed by quantum physics at the time, accepted by Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, and the others, even Schrödinger, but Schrödinger thought there was a kind of immaterial wave involved. Einstein didn't like it, but he was mainly worried about non-locality. We'll come to that at another point in time. We want to believe the world is really there when it is not being observed. This is John Bell's, what he writes. I certainly believe the world is there, and I believe it will be there after me. And I believe you are part of it. And I believe that most physicists take this point of view. But here again, you've got to understand that he's not saying he's performed any experiments to prove that the world is there. He just says it's the way I want it to be. And the same is true today. In one of my other videos, I give a little clip of Sean Carroll, claims he's a naturalist, although he believes in the schoolboy version of many worlds, says, I think that most physicists take a view in their heart, he actually says in their heart, that, the world is a material place. He does not say, we've performed these experiments which have proved it. And in fact, he believes in many worlds. If you can get Cartesian solid matter into the many worlds theory, you should actually be eligible for an infinite number of Nobel Prizes, because it's impossible. The many worlds theory is not naturalist at all. The many worlds theory doesn't get rid of consciousness at all. And the many worlds theory is not materialist, unless you change the meaning of material, as a lot of people do, a lot of philosophers do, by sleight of hand, sleight of mind, when they want to pretend they're materialist, but the matter they're referring to is not quite the same as the matter of, Cartesian world. But we'll forget about that. A minor point. What Tom Campbell says is true. These people want a material world, and what they decided to do was to change the way of talking about it, so the words they used kind of pretended the material world was still there. And not only that, I can give you an example where Heisenberg actually says this very thing. Because Einstein went to this brilliant mathematical physicist, David Bohm, who's very, very important. And he said, look, David, I really don't like this quantum mysticism of Bohr. We've got to get rid of it. Now, you're good with maths. Einstein wasn't a particularly good mathematician. So he said, look, Bohm, we do a bit of jiggery-pokery with these equations and give me back my material world. Read this, you see all the quotes, you see this is all true. So Bohm got on the job and he changed the equations around. In other words, he was such a good mathematician, he produced an equation which was the same but different kind of thing, which gave exactly the same predictions, but you were able to talk about it in a different way. And the reason you were able to talk about it in a different way was because a certain bits of the world behaved in a more classical-like way, a more materialist-like way. Other bits in the world, just fell to pieces, became totally quantum. Your teacup was instantaneously connected to stars the other side of the universe, and all kinds of weird stuff happened. But electrons and some other quantum particles seem to behave the way they did in the old classical type world, and that's what he did. This was called the pilot wave interpretation. And pilot wave interpretation was there purely to get rid of the idea the world wasn't there when you weren't looking at it. So the world disappeared when you weren't looking at it. Now, Heisenberg came along and he said, so this is Heisenberg, and he wrote a criticism of David Bohm's pilot wave theory, which had bits of quantum matter being shoved around the place with pilot waves. And this is an important point, that in the pilot wave theory, it's only a small portion of the world which behaves, in a kind of classically materialistic kind of fashion. There's loads of weird other stuff goes on, such as quantum particles are instantaneously connected across vast cosmic differences, and if one moves here, it moves the other side of the universe. This is non-locality, comes from the quantum into the classical dimension. Also, the pilot wave is connected to every quantum particle. It is to such an extent that the number of dimensions it has approaches infinity. But all this is ignored by people who want to have a materialist world. And I've got a lot of books by recent philosophers, physicists, and they all present pilot wave theory as if it didn't really have all these other very weird aspects which Bohm realised didn't give him a material universe. They just ignore all the non-classical aspects, or they kind of tuck it away so that the reader doesn't really understand that the pilot wave theory is a bit of a fraud. And Bohm knew this because he realised the bits which didn't behave classically meant he had to develop it, and he developed it into a much more mystical theory involving consciousness. The dreaded consciousness rears its head. But this stack of books by recent, physicists and philosophers don't mention that Bohm actually realised his pilot wave theory had deep holes which needed for him to develop it in a much more spectacular direction. Bohm made the proposal in 1952, and Heisenberg wrote an essay, Criticisms and Counter-Proposals to the Copenhagen Interpretation of Quantum Theory. When one analyses the papers of those who do not want to change the Copenhagen interpretation so far as predictions of experimental results are concerned, but try to change the language of this interpretation in order to get a closer resemblance to classical physics. It is important to realise from the beginning that their interpretations cannot be refuted by experiment. But of course they won't be, because they've just changed the equations in a way so that bits of the world look a bit more like material bits and pieces, where the rest of the world falls into quantum soup. But anyway, so what? This objective description reveals itself as an ideological superstructure which has little to do with immediate physical reality. So what he's saying basically is that you're transforming the equations of the Copenhagen interpretation to try and make it look a bit more like a classical material type world, but you're just indulging in this for ideological reasons. Trying to make the world look more material, because Einstein doesn't like an immaterial world. It's all here, what Tom Campbell says is precisely correct. And after that, all kinds of word spinning and new ways of viewing the double slit experiment came about, as he says, entanglement, this, that and the other. But when you analyse them, they are all fraudulent. They're all using word deception to try and pretend that the material world is still there when it demonstrably isn't. I mean, even Zurek talks about information physics. He knows the material world's not there anymore. Or not in the way materialists want it to be. Such insights lead us into an entirely new dimension of the ground of being. As Anthony Aguirre, in his brilliant book, Cosmological Kinds, writes, thus we arrive at a strange place. We break things down into smaller and smaller pieces, but then the pieces, when examined, are not there. Just arrangements of them are. What then are things? If things are forms of forms of forms of forms, and if forms are order, and order is defined by us, who define macrostates, and by history, which actualizes them, and by the universe, which undergirds the order, then those forms, it would seem, do not exist in and of themselves. They exist, it would appear, only as created by and in relation to us and the universe. They are, the Buddha might say, emptiness. Now, emptiness is a Buddhist technical term in Madhyamaka Buddhism, shunyata. And emptiness does not mean nothingness, it means a field of potentiality. And further examination will take us into the idea that emptiness is a doorway into primordial awareness. So the field of potentiality is activated by the cognitive tendency or cognitive pressure of primordial consciousness, primordial awareness. Primordial awareness has an inner tendency to unfold fields of potentiality into the illusion of the material world in order to explore its own nature. As Aguirre says in his chapter on the mind-only school of Buddhism, which is Yogacara Chittamatra, Yogacara in the Indian form, Chittamatra in the Tibetan form. Perhaps, as Eddington enjoins, we should accept the view that the substratum of everything is of a mental character, and that we must postulate something indefinite but yet continuous with our mental nature. This is not to say that an electron or a rock has experience or feelings or thoughts anything like ours. Rather, it is raising the possibility that not just some systems, but all systems have both a physical and mental side to them. That the ideas of pure physicality and pure mentality both dissolve on very close inspection. And as we shall see in just a moment, this is exactly the conclusion that Bohm, with his later associate Basil Hiley, come to in a very important book, The Undivided Universe. But the fact that the dualistic world of the mental and physical dissolve into a deeper level does not make that level itself, a deeper level of materiality, as Bohm pointed out. It has a nature closer to consciousness. Matter can't exist in the quantum field as matter. The quantum field is immaterial. Consciousness can, or the non-individuated nature of consciousness. And this is what seems to be the case. If you analyse the situation with integrity. This is what consciousness is. Consciousness is the cognitive force through which the universe explores its own potentialities. This is what consciousness is. And it can be directly experienced through advanced Buddhist meditation. And there were people living in Tibet and India before that, or in these regions, who practiced extraordinary methods of yogic meditational insight, and they moved their mind through levels of consciousness that Wojciech and Leggett, philosophers, could not even begin to imagine. And they realized, or they actually directly saw, levels of consciousness at the base of the creation of the universe. Here's a description, and this is a description from a book, translation and philosophical explanation by the amazing philosopher and Buddhist practitioner Herbert V. Gunther. This is his book, The Matrix of Mystery. Scientific and humanistic aspects of Dzogchen thought. And Dzogchen is a very old, pre-Buddhist, just call it mystical is not to do it full. It's what Westerners tend to call mysticism, but it's precise meditational techniques to understand functioning of consciousness at levels that most Westerners wouldn't even begin to comprehend. And these are translations from the remarkable Dzogchen Tibetan yogi Longchenpa. The root of our material mental universe is this self-existent, pristine cognitiveness, a point-instant virtual singularity. Since its facticity is open-dimensioned and not discernible as any concrete thing, it is a meaning-saturated field as pristine cognitiveness. And this is actually a description of the quantum field. As long as you understand that the quantum field must have an internal cognitive aspect of consciousness, which I will demonstrate in part 2 of this video series. This radiation field of this open dimension is the intrinsic votive character of pristine cognitiveness. Since this is there as its own lucency, as yet undifferentiated into colour values, it is the quasi-mirroring pristine cognitiveness. Since these modes of pristine cognitiveness are self-existent, identical with respect to their lucency and indivisible, this facet is termed the auto-reflexive identity pristine cognitiveness. Since by understanding correctly the meaning value of this cognitive character of being, all intentional ideation is actualized spontaneously, it is from this pentad of pristine cognitions as the operational source of the intelligible universe that the 84,000 portals to life's meaning open up. Now this is a description of deep levels, of the operation of deep levels of consciousness, as I say, which unfold quantum potentialities from what Longchenpa calls the meaning field. What is the quantum field which produces flashes of apparent materiality and cognitive moments which cognize these flashes? As David Bohm points out, we're going to David Bohm. David Bohm left behind his attempt at materialist description of quantum functioning. He realized it was nonsense. When he went further into the implications of what he had done, he realized that basically his views, his analysis of quantum functioning led him directly into the world of Dzogchen, the world of Buddhism, the world of the meaning fields, activated by pristine cognitiveness. These are what David Bohm called the implicate order, the Holo movement. All this stuff I've just quoted from Dzogchen, David Bohm embraced in his later work in a book called The Undivided Universe with another brilliant mathematician called Basil Hiley. Here's the book here. The Undivided Universe, David Bohm and Basil Hiley. Fantastic book. Well, in this book, Bohm and Heidi say that even electrons have an aspect of consciousness because consciousness permeates the ground quantum field of the Holo movement. So here is what Bohm and Heidi write. The content of our own consciousness is then some part of this overall process. It is thus implied that in some sense a rudimentary mind-like quality is present even at the level of particle physics, and that as we go to subtler levels, this mind-like quality becomes stronger and more developed. Each kind and level of mind may have a relative autonomy and stability. One may then describe the essential mode of relationship of all these as participation, recalling that this word has two basic meanings: to partake of and to take part in. Through enfoldment, each relatively autonomous level of mind partakes of the whole to one degree or another. Through this, it partakes of all the others in its gathering of information. And through the activity of this information, it similarly takes part in the whole and in every part. It is in this sort of activity that the content of the more subtle and implicate levels are unfolded, e.g. as the movement of the particle unfolds the meaning of the information that is implicit in the quantum field, and as the movement of the body unfolds what is implicit in subtler levels of thought, feeling, etc. And this description describes the overall mechanism or movement of what Bohm had called, and what Bohm and Heidi still called, the Holo movement, which is the movement of the whole of a kind of holographic reality in which consciousness and the appearance of matter is enfolded and unfolds into the what they term the explicate world of the everyday world, moving through time, and it is viewed as a kind of, almost infinite holographic field of information, which has as its essential nature a consciousness-like quality. And this is all described, analysed in this book.
If we wish, look on the world as a whole. Consciousness is really our most immediate experience of this implicate order. And you might think of nets of consciousness that are finer and finer, or we might think of capturing finer and finer aspects of the implicate order. I think there's an intelligence that's implicit there, you see, to say that a kind of intelligence unfolds. The source of intelligence is not necessarily in the brain, you see, the ultimate source, but much more enfolded into the whole. Now, the question, what do you want to call it, God, that depends on what you mean by the word, you see, because taking it as a personal God might restrict it in some way.
Basil Heidi is still alive. He's working at Birkbeck College, I think. He recently was involved in a a major film about David Bohm's work, and there was a whole load of philosophers discussing it. David Bohm's, in vogue. It has an important role to play, obviously, in my most recent book, the Tibetan book of the Undivided Universe. David Bohm's Quantum Philosophy of Wholeness in the Light of Buddhist Metaphysics. And this book is particularly about David Bohm's ideas, his later ideas, as they relate and reflect and are mutually resonant with Dzogchen and Yogacara Buddhism, but also some Madhyamaka. What I'm saying is that basically when you analyze this stuff with precision, materialism is left long behind in the world for schoolboy and schoolgirl philosophers, as we've seen. Anyway, enough said for this first part. It's much longer than I expected it to be, but the problem is to go over all the material necessary. It takes a long time. Anyway, I hope you join me in part 2.